Hi, welcome to this webinar on how to be an ally. I'm Dr. Reena Jamnadas, Head of Talent Practice for Development within Catfinity. And Catfinity are the world leaders in strengths-based assessment and development. So I'm delighted to be here with you during this webinar. And before we get into the topic, I'd like you to think about what the word ally actually means to you. What actually immediately comes to mind when you think of that word in the context of our workplace? So to help with this, there's a picture that you can see on the screen right now with a group of people that are working together. And have a think about, would we be able to point out the person or the people that might be allies in this particular picture? Well, the answer, as always, isn't quite as simple as we might think, because actually everybody in this picture has the potential to be an ally, although it actually doesn't mean that everybody is. So how would we know, or how would we be able to identify who an ally actually is? So to help with that, let's start to think about what it actually means in terms of a definition of being an ally. Now, if you look at the definition here, in the context of anyone who may be marginalised in their current work or context, what is the role that an ally actually plays? What do you think is the missing word in this description that you see on the screen? Now, when I first saw this, my first instinct was to say that an ally is anyone that helps or helps anyone who may be marginalised in their current work context. But then I read an interview with someone called Karen Catlin, who's the author of a book called Better Allies: Everyday Actions to Create Inclusive, Engaging Workplaces. And she declares that the word helps could actually be seen as a knight in shining armour rather than an ally. So the sense that a knight is someone who rushes in to save the individual, the sense of being a rescuer. And in the context of someone that's in an underrepresented group, the implication is that if we need saving, we're actually perceived as being weak or helpless, which we know actually isn't the case. So instead, perhaps the missing word should be something that actually shows the difference between a champion and a rescuer. So there could be a number of ways that we think about who an ally actually is. It could be someone that takes responsibility for their own behaviours. It could be someone that's self-educated about what it means to be privileged. Maybe people or a person that works to build a community and a culture of people that are passionate about promoting equality, passionate about creating a sense of trust in the workplace, and they might leverage their personal relationships or build new collaborations to do that. An ally might be someone that, demonstrates public acts of advocacy. Allies generally will endeavour to drive change in a workplace's, practices and culture. Now, there's a story to help bring that to life as well, and it's related to the CEO of YouTube, who at the time was Susan Wojcicki. And Susan spoke about how the tech industry titan Bill Campbell was an ally for her. There's an article for Vanity Fair that she actually shared this anecdote in that I'd like to share with you. So what she said is that she learned about an important invitation-only conference where some of the world's top leaders in tech and media were actually getting together, and she found that her name was left off the guest list. Now, many of the invitees were her peers, and it meant that YouTube wouldn't actually be represented at this event, even though deals might have been made and plans were going to be made. YouTube wouldn't have been represented. And Susan actually shares that she started to question whether she even belonged at the conference. But rather than let it go, she turned to Bill, as someone that she trusted and knew as having a lot of influence and might be able to help support her through that situation. Now, Bill immediately recognised that she had a rightful place at that event, and within a day, he worked his magic and she received her invitation. So it's a brilliant example of where, in this case, Bill actually played the role of an ally, recognised that there wasn't a sense of a sense of inclusion in terms of her involvement at this significant event, and actually transformed that for her. So the next big question is, once we understand what an ally is, what's the impact that allies have in the workplace, and can it really change things? So I'd like to share another piece of research that was conducted by 3 researchers, Richard Martel, David Lane, and Cynthia Emrich, and they modelled a fictional group of employees. So there were, at the start of this experiment, there were 50% of men and women, and they simulated a company with 8 different levels of promotion. And at each of the 8 stages, the men had just a 1% difference in performance ratings. But that 1% difference in performance ratings led to a huge discrepancy at the top level, with only 35% of the highest level positions being filled by women. So in this instance, what's a relatively small gender bias actually leads to quite a significant effect in terms of the performance ratings that led to a substantially lower promotion rate for women. So it really just brings home the power that that just a small percentage can have. So in applying that back to being an ally, imagine the positive impact that a positive champion can actually have. So there's other evidence that shows that when men were intentionally engaged in gender inclusion programs, 96% of those organizations actually saw progress, compared to only 30% of organizations where men weren't actually engaged. So it's not just that race or gender of a person can be influenced. There could be so many other aspects that leads to diversity or inclusion and a sense of belonging, where allies can play a really significant role. So in addition, there's some research that was done recently by an organisation called Change Catalyst that shows that people who have at least one ally at work are nearly twice as likely to be satisfied and really feel a sense of belonging. And we believe that that's because allies help create a really positive team culture. And that tends to be known as a psychologically safe workplace. It's an environment where people feel safe to be authentic and feel a sense of inclusion and belonging. And allies contribute to that sense of safety and trust, that sense that someone really has your back, so to speak. So now that we've explored what we mean by being an ally, the rest of this session will explore what things we can actually do to embrace actions and behaviours where we can be an ally and champion a positive team culture for everyone. So there are 3 sections with 10 helpful steps to become an ally that we're going to focus on. And this is the very first section that we'll focus on now. So the sense of getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. Now, what often holds us back from being more active as an ally could actually be fear. The fear of being uncomfortable or getting it wrong. The fear of being vulnerable or outside of our comfort zone. Now, the irony of that is that in order to develop new skills or grow, we almost always need to get outside of our comfort zone. But discomfort can really block the new behaviours that are so important for us to learn. Now, there was one study that was published by Psychological Science where the researchers found that when we reframe our attitude towards discomfort, that actually changed. And this is quite ironic, but their research showed that when we make the goal to actually feel awkward and uncomfortable in a number of activities, so making the goal to feel that sense of being uncomfortable, they found that participants with that goal compared to a control group spent more time improvising and they showed more risk-taking relative to those that didn't. And the authors really interpreted that as showing that they were more motivated during the task as well. So those participants were also more likely to believe that they'd achieved their personal goals during that particular exercise. So that's really powerful, just in terms of reframing the way that we view situations that do make us feel uncomfortable, and how much further that can actually take us. So how can we actually take steps to getting comfortable with being uncomfortable? Well, in the case of allyship and navigating issues such as race or sexuality and gender, we can often get really overwhelmed with the sense of getting out of our comfort zone, especially if that zone is initially quite small, where we might have limited knowledge about some of these areas as well. And what can work really well is to reframe that as expanding our comfort zone. So not necessarily going beyond it, but expanding the sense of comfort that we have with the existing knowledge or experience that we have as well. So an example of that might be gender neutrality as a topic, and our comfort zone with that might be quite small. So an initial small first step might be, for instance, to listen to a podcast that expands our zone, rather than going on a protest that might stop us from acting at all. So increasing our knowledge in small and tangible ways to help expand that comfort zone is a really good starting point. And an example of that might be where we've seen the increased use of pronouns. And we've seen that on social media, at the end of people's email signatures at work, where an individual has the opportunity to express whether they identify with being recognised as she, he, or they. Now, that's led to that. I think people have really expanded their knowledge in terms of understanding what that means for how they relate to other people, or how they might refer to other people to create a sense of synergy, inclusion, and belonging, and what that might mean for other aspects of their life as well. So it's a small change that's actually led to people learning more about how people might identify differently in terms of gender. So with discomfort as a goal, what other parts of our mindset do we also need to adjust? And that leads us on to step 2, which is to adopt the mindset of different like me, not different from me. Now, what do we mean by that? If you look at the visual on this slide, the straws that we see here are symbolic of that mindset. So let's imagine if we imagine that we're actually the silver straw to all of the others are different from them. But actually, from an outsider's point of view, all of the straws are quite unique and different. So rather than starting from a point of spotting the ways that other people are dissimilar or different to us, it might serve us better to actually start from the point of view that difference is universal, and that we need to look beyond what our assumptions might be. Now, adopting that mindset means uncovering and really thinking about the uniqueness of the experiences of other people, or the diversity around us. And we need to ensure that we don't make assumptions or generalize what we know about people or their experiences as well. So, for example, if there's a parent, are they more or less likely to travel within their role? As a workplace, do we tend to give parents the first choice when it comes to when to take annual leave during holiday time, or where children might be off school? Another important area might be in terms of festivities. So with Christmas, there's often a longer break, but does everyone embrace that holiday in the same way? Because it's not always seen as a religious holiday. For Christians, for instance, or people that are not Christian, and they might want to take holiday during other parts of the year as well. So, and also the way that, we often have meetings, let's say on a Monday, and we'll very naturally ask the question, how was your weekend, but does everyone enjoy talking about their weekends? And for some people, they might feel uncomfortable about what it might expose. So really, it's about being an ally. We should um, take an approach where we really think about a growth mindset and think about all of these different aspects from different perspectives, but also think of ourselves as a work in progress that's constantly learning and improving ourselves in terms of expanding our comfort zone. Now, sometimes we're not even aware of the difference enough to spot where our assumptions and where some of the shortcuts we make might actually be. And that leads us on to step 3, where we can think about how to focus on ourselves a little bit more. Because without that insight about ourselves and where our starting place is, we can't always start to advocate that for other people. And that's where the term privilege becomes quite important. So privilege is a term that we often hear being discussed in the context of diversity and inclusion, but can often be misunderstood as well. Now, some people can get quite defensive about their own backgrounds and defend a perceived sense of privilege that they may not believe that they actually have. So we like to use the statement sometimes that's on the slide to actually reframe the way that the term privilege is perceived. So just to share that, it's a useful way to think about it is that privilege isn't the presence of perks and benefits, it's actually the absence of obstacles and barriers. Now, an example of that might be someone that has a background with many different challenges and difficulties from a low income in their childhood. Now, whilst the low income would have made life challenging, it might have created hurdles for them. They might have had to work really hard to overcome that. Whereas someone else in the same situation might have been blocked from even attempting to overcome those hurdles on the basis of their skin colour, their disability, or their sexuality, for instance. Another example is signing up to the army. Now here, the privilege could simply be being heterosexual. So no matter how hard the journey has been, to get accepted within the army, simply being heterosexual will have made that easier. If you compare that to someone that's openly homosexual, they may have even been denied the chance to apply. So being an ally requires really recognizing the advantages, the opportunities, the resources and the power that we may have automatically been accorded, whilst others may have been overtly or subtly denied them. Another example is that white men, research shows, are also far less likely to have to code switch or adjust their style of speech, the way they communicate with others, or their appearance, or their behaviour, to actually fit in with a particular culture, and in order to increase their chances of being hired or accepted or promoted. And that's simply by being male. So that helps give us an understanding of privilege. And let's now go on to actually quickly test our thinking in relation to building on that as well. So to really think about that, I'd like you to look at the slide here and have a think about which line is actually longer. So I hope you've come up with your answers. Now the answer is that line A obviously is longer. But did that seem too easy to be true? Did the circle on B actually challenge your thinking and actually cause you to doubt yourself? Now that's known as the power of conformity, and it can have a significant effect. In a similar experiment by a psychologist called Ash, 75% of subjects agreed with the wrong statement about this line length. Can you believe that? Now, sometimes outside influences can skew our brains, and our fear of being wrong can then override our rational thinking. So If we fear being wrong, we may be at risk of not actually making any changes at all when it comes to being an ally. And that actually links to our next step. So in terms of step 4, it's important to lead strong and be wrong. And isn't that something amazing to actually get comfortable with doing? So leading strong and being wrong. And that's about recognizing our personal blocks or the fears that we might have in being uncomfortable. So as we discussed before, getting it wrong is a chance to learn. It's not a failure or an endpoint. It's simply expanding our comfort zone. And the quote on this slide really sums that up. So it's really important to really think about that. Now, the avoidance of conflict or mistakes can actually feed a culture of conformity, as we looked at with that line, for instance, and it can put people under pressure to start to keep any of their own personal perspectives to themselves, or where they might have a challenging point of view or a different point of view, or one that might add value. If they lack confidence in that, they may be reluctant to actually share that and actually conform to group thinking. Whereas by contrast, demonstrating intellectual humility and actually recognizing the limits of our own perspectives and the knowledge that we have might actually help others to be more open to learning about the people that hold different views. By simply saying that I was wrong, it leads to that sense of psychological safety and being open. And being intellectually humble and rewarding the courage to admit mistakes and show vulnerability has the power to actually create a culture where difference is supported, and it's so much easier to actually be an ally. So we've covered the first section in terms of thinking about being an ally, and in section 2, what we're going to focus on now is practicing both learning and unlearning the things that relate to us. So learning is how we evolve, but unlearning is how we keep up as the world around us evolves. Unlearning is actually a form of agility in an ever-changing context, and strong allies constantly correct their own words and actions so that they don't unintentionally harm or cause discomfort to others. So to explore that a little bit more, I'd like you to take a moment and feel free to even pause this recording to ask yourself what skill you've picked up this year and what belief have you changed. And in our experience, we find it much easier to answer the first one rather than the second. But take a moment to actually reflect on that, and feel free to pause this recording. So I hope you found that reflection helpful. In one of my own examples, I've learned how to use a new expenses system at work. Some of you might relate to this, where it's all electronic now, and a huge shift away from those good old spreadsheets. It means that all I need to do is take a picture of my receipt and upload it to an app. And then the app actually automatically submits those expenses. So that's a new process that I've learned, but I'm struggling to actually stop saving my receipts in the old way. So although I don't need to keep a paper version of all the receipts that I have, I still feel compelled to actually keep hold of them, even though I don't need to until the expenses have been processed. So I'm really comfortable with learning the new system, but struggling to unlearn the old process that I used to go through. So give some thought to what that might mean for you. And what we're going to look at now are the tools that will help us unlearn and be a great ally. So one of the interesting things to help us unfold that in more detail is an actual exercise where I'd like you to look at the numbers on the slide, and can you guess what the rule is? And to take it a step further, if you know what the rule is, which of the numbers on the right would you use to test your theory? Now, in this test, most people actually choose A and D to confirm their theory that the rule is that the numbers actually go up by 2. And whilst A and D do indeed work with those rules, it's actually incorrect. And I was I was so surprised to actually learn that, and really just wanted to understand what the rule actually is. So what's interesting is that the choices of A and D both confirm the same thing. It shows that we really tend to select the things that give us the same results rather than think about other ways that might disprove our theory. That can often be our natural instinct. And psychologists describe that sort of thinking as what's known as confirmation bias. So we look at what confirms our view of the world and pay less attention to the things that might contradict it. Now, for those of you interested, the rule for this particular exercise is simply that the numbers need to be higher as the sequence progresses. So I hope that helps you. Now, in the context of being a great ally, we need to improve our power of noticing to really spot situations where being an ally is going to support someone or a situation and would be considered to be valuable. Now, the way that we can be a great ally is when our bounded awareness, often gets in the way. So where the information that's right in front of our eyes becomes really difficult to interpret, or seeing what we want to see can actually get in the way. So what's important to really uncover is to notice what we consider our normal. What's our viewpoint of the world in terms of what we consider to be normal that might lead to that confirmation bias. So looking at the slide right now, have a think about how many of your interactions confirm your world view. And there's some examples that are on the slide here in terms of what some of those things might be. They might be totally different for you, but it just brings to life that in order to unlearn, we need to be able to recognize what our normal actually is. Now, so as I say on the slide, there's lots of different examples of the things that we might assume. And it doesn't mean that we should become overly nosy or curious about other people's personal lives, but simply noticing the norms in our team can be quite interesting. Now, the purple flag that's just come up on the screen now is an idea that came from someone called Kim Scott, who's very well known for a TED Talk, and she's the author of the bestseller book called Radical Candor. And Kim actually talks about using a metaphorical purple flag as a code word in our interactions with others. So what she explains is it's not a red flag, but the red flag is less daunting, and it's the red flag's equally attention-grabbing cousin, a purple flag. And the purple flag could actually be a tool that acts as a code word to identify bias as it appears in meetings and conversations. So where we might be using our sense of what's normal to us that might influence a bias that we have to other people. So the purple flag could be something that's used to spark a safe conversation and safe reflection and normalize the idea that we will all have biases that need further investigation or further interrogation when they occur, and they may occur, totally unconsciously. But a purple flag creates a safe space to really start a dialogue around that. Now, there's an example that Kim Scott actually gives us. And once she asked her team to go out to lunch, and out came the purple flag by one person who was part of that discussion. Now, at first, Kim had no idea why that purple flag had come up. So she asked to talk to that person after the meeting. And after the meeting, the person actually reminded Kim that they were fasting for Ramadan, which is a really important ritual and event that happens within Islam, the religion of Islam, where there's a period of fasting. Now that instantly made sense, and she discovered something that she could be more aware of in terms of creating a sense of inclusion and belonging. But she recognized that she needed to unlearn and notice her norm. And in this instance, it was her Christian lens on religious events. Another example might be, going for drinks after work. And there might be some people who don't drink. And so what's another inclusive activity after work that encourages socializing, or whatever the objective might be, that again challenges the lens that we have on our own sense of the norm. But we also need to accept that we can't know everything or be completely assumption free. And we need to do more than just wait to hear a code word, which actually leads us then onto step 6. So step 6 really focuses on always seeking feedback. Now, making mistakes is obviously what makes us all human and authentic, creates an environment of learning, creates that psychological safety. And how we respond or cope with them sets a culture for others to actually follow. Now, the truly brave amongst us can request feedback on not only our actions, but also our thinking, really asking for feedback on our thinking. Now, that takes courage, but it gives us really valuable information and sends a message that growth is welcome. It creates an environment of trust where people may feel psychologically safe to be vulnerable, and also take a similar approach in terms of their growth and learning. And the term intellectual humility is a great one to embrace here, because admitting that we always have room to grow and learn, and really setting the tone that all feedback is welcome, even if it doesn't always change things, can create a really powerful learning culture. Now, on the slide is an example of a situation where, imagine you need to find a solution to a new challenge, but you're under pressure to do it quickly. And you might choose a few trusted people to help you get the job done. So it's a situation we may have all found ourselves in. We're under pressure, we need to get it done. What's the first thing that we do? We're naturally going to go to those that we know, that have the level of expertise, and we trust that they'll be able to deliver very quickly. Now, just take a moment here to think about that scenario in terms of what our intention might have been versus the impact that we might have created. Now, in this example, the key part is that being under pressure and doing it quickly might lead to a shortcut. That means that we choose like-minded people and reinforces a filter or a bubble, in terms of the people we're naturally going to go to, in terms of those that we get on with, that are like-minded, or that we might have existing positive relationships and friendships with. Now, that was an example of a senior executive that gave this example to me when they were in a time of crisis, and they would always rely on those that thought like them when time was of the essence. But the longer term impact of that was even more damaging. And in this instance, in this example, it could actually impact culture, where the trusted inner group might give an indication of favoritism, and that the selection is unequal. And actually, it also may hinder diversity, because by going to people that are similar to us, or we know and trust will deliver in a certain way, excludes those that may bring different perspectives, a fresh pair of eyes on things, and new ways of thinking. So although the intention made sense and was a very natural response, the impact could actually be quite damaging, or have a different effect. So it's important to really think about that in terms of our intention versus our impact. So step 7 is about being aware when our positive intentions may actually have a negative impact. Now, biases, or what's known as sometimes microaggressions are often unintentional and tend to emerge more often when we're stressed, tired, or under pressure. And it's at those times that we fall into autopilot. Now, that can also, I mean, we would always have positive intentions or biases that are intended to really support other people, but we are falling into an autopilot that prevents us from thinking more broadly. And we're often more in tune to negative biases as well. So, for instance, we might look at our phone when we're in a meeting or ignore the emails, for instance, of someone who's difficult. But positively intentioned biases are often just as damaging. So, if, for instance, we're constantly thinking about or singling out someone that has a really interesting hobby, and we might be impressed by it, and we might constantly, praise that person about how well they're doing, or say, I wish we could do that. It sends a signal of what success actually means to us as a leader, that might exclude other talents or interests that are in the room, or in the conversation. So that's one of the hardest things to really spot and change, but really important to start to be aware of. So sections 1 and 2 in this webinar so far have dealt with a lot of tweaks to the way we think and the mindsets that we adopt. And the final section is going to focus on how we can actually take action. So how can we really transform that level of awareness that we have to actually be an advocate? So those are the steps that we're going to go through now. Now, in her book, it was published in 2018, there's a psychologist called Chugg who talks about the difference between believers and builders in the context of making a difference in the world. And she describes a world where awareness of inequality and even experience of diversity has actually increased, especially in the under 30s, and they're the believers. However, taking action and making a difference is actually where the gap is in terms of being a builder. So there's lots of people that are wanting to make a difference. They really feel passionately about it. But there's a discrepancy between those versus those that are actually building and taking action. So awareness is the first step, but action is obviously the desired outcome. And we shouldn't just become more aware of an issue, but we should become more aware of an issue so that we can go on to help and actually create a change to that particular situation. So moving on from that's a really bad response to how can I actually help is the mindset that's really powerful to develop. Now, to highlight this, I'd like to share a study from the 1970s that was conducted by Darley and Batson. It's a fairly famous study, so some of you may have come across this before, but it's really relevant in this context. Now, in the study, there were a set of seminary students who were asked to complete a questionnaire about their religion and to begin some psychology experiments in one particular building. And then they were told to go to another building to actually prepare a talk. Now, half of the group were asked to prepare a talk about the Good Samaritan, and half were asked to actually prepare a talk about seminary jobs. Now, what the experimenters did is they varied the amount of urgency that they told the subjects before sending them to the other building. So in one condition, they told the subjects that they were late for the task. So that came under the high hurry category. In the other, they told the group that they had a few minutes, but they should head over or be on their way. And that was low hurry. And in the third condition, they were told that there was plenty of time and that actually they were early. So that was the no hurry condition. Now, on the way to the second building, all of the participants passed a man who was actually an actor that was in on the task. He was in an alleyway, sitting slumped in the doorway, and the man moaned and coughed twice as they walked by. So the victim's condition is unclear, are they hurt or are they drunk? We're not quite sure. But what the experimenters did was they observed how the seminary students reacted to this man. So I'd like you to pause for a minute and just estimate what percentage of the seminary students do you think offered help to the victim? So just take a moment to reflect on that. Okay, I'm about to reveal the answer. So in fact, only 40% of the seminary students offered help to the victim, even when their next task was to do a talk on the parable of the Good Samaritan. Quite ironic. Now, breaking this down, the researchers found that the amount of hurriedness induced in the subjects had a major effect on helping behaviour. So in the no hurry situations, 63% actually helped. And in the low hurry situations, 45% actually helped. And in the high hurry situations, only 10% helped. And some actually literally stepped over the victim on their way to the next building. So it's likely that most of us would agree that taking action to help others is important, but when we're under pressure, it's so easy for those good intentions to fall by the wayside. And that really leads us onto our next action tool in terms of step 8. So step 8 really focuses on show and don't tell. So to become great advocates, we need to show it in our actions, not just our words, not just paying lip service, but actually translating that into taking action. So another piece of research that was conducted by Elizabeth Levy-Pallock shows how the media actually affects people's perceptions in terms of all of the norms and behaviours that we might experience, even when it doesn't affect our beliefs. And the degree to which people act in prejudiced ways, there's a high correlation between that and the degree to which people think is that, the extent to which someone thinks that something is okay, not just in the eyes of others. So just one person questioning the social norm can loosen the hold of that. Otherwise, there does tend to be that link in terms of where we're quite impressionable, I guess, in terms of some of those ways. So to really help with that, one of the topic that that's often raised is about education. And what's great is that people are interested in learning more to understand difference, what makes people different, how to embrace diversity, how to create a sense of inclusion and belonging. They want to understand a different perspective. So that's positive. But what's challenging is that sometimes we rely on someone else and often one person to gain that education. And in a work context, that might be singling out the difference to be the spokesperson and the educator all rolled into one. And whilst there are quite a few issues with that approach, one of them is that it actually pushes the burden of responsibility back onto those that actually need the support. So that's why the action tool number 9 that we're suggesting here is to do the work yourself. It means educate yourself. Don't rely on others or that person that represents that difference to actually bring in that different perspective. Rely on educating yourself to do that by going out to seek information rather than expecting it to be brought to your attention. Now, a really simple example of that here might be a really simple but very powerful is actually the spelling of people's names. And there's an American actress called Uzumaka, and her surname is Aduba. And she once said in an interview that when she asked her mother as a teenager if she could change her name to Zoe, her mother actually replied, if they can learn to say Tchaikovsky, Michelangelo, and Dostoevsky, they can learn to say Uzumaka. And that's a really powerful example of actually creating a sense of belonging purely in terms of pronouncing people's names correctly and making the effort to do that. So whilst asking someone how to pronounce their name is just one action, it still singles that difference. And an even better one is to educate ourselves first. An even better example would be to introduce the phonetic spelling of everyone's names to email signatures so that it becomes the norm regardless of background. So even if you think yours is obvious, see the example of Peter on the slide here, what we're actually doing by introducing the phonetic spelling of everyone's names to email signatures, just as an example of this, is that we're normalizing those conversations and not highlighting a difference. It's very similar to the pronouns example that we talked about earlier. That's really increased in people's email signatures, statements, social medias. That it's so much more common now than ever, that promotes that sense of understanding. So that's a really powerful change that can create quite a significant difference. Now, public acts of advocacy are also important, whether it's calling someone out when they might misspeak something. An example might be, I need to babysit my kids tonight. And that's actually taken by a male CEO in response to why they couldn't attend an event. And the wording of that is interesting because they use the word, I need to babysit my children, as opposed to just being a parent, simply because they're male. So so the quote on the slide that you see here is actually by psychologist Anita Ratton, who, from her research with Carol Dweck, talked about whether we believe in other people's growth mindsets or their ability to change as to whether we actually confront people. Now, most of us have had an example where we've observed someone making statements that might make other people feel a little bit uncomfortable. And calling it out is a term that's often used to avoid being a bystander. Now, what we suggest here with step number 10 is to be the step when calling it out and not the brick wall. So an example of a situation where we may have wanted to intervene, and a personal example of mine is where I was at a same-sex wedding where the grandparent of one of the brides actually publicly shared her negative views about gay marriage. Now, in the situation of us being a brick wall or barrier, it might be to share our thoughts on how we thought, that comment is inappropriate, as many of us might do. But an ally approach would be to say something more like, I feel differently about what you've just said, and then going on to share your thoughts. But even better would be getting their permission to continue and say something like, I have some thoughts on this, if I may share. So the staircase metaphor is one that mirrors the 10 action steps throughout this session. That's a really powerful way of remembering that, all of which contribute to being an ally. So we hope you found this webinar useful. Thank you so much for listening. The slide here shows a reminder of the 10 steps to becoming an ally. And there's also a really powerful quote that really just highlights how it could be the smallest things that make the biggest difference over time in terms of us being an ally, planting seeds, and that sustainable change may take a long time, but it's the small things that can make the biggest difference. There's also some recommended reading that I will share on the final slide, and a number of resources in the last few years on this particular topic that will hopefully be of interest to you if you'd like to know more. So I will leave you to just capture that. Please feel free to take a photo of the recommendations here, and I will leave that on the screen. Thank you very much for watching this webinar. I hope you found it useful.